And we're continuing with the fourth chapter of Mary Poppins in the Park, which is called The Park in the Park. Jane and Michael have shrunk down to the size of the plasticine people that Jane made to live in her poor people's park. They're in the house of Mr. Moe, whose wife Jane crumpled into a ball, but who miraculously remained alive and is a bit of a grouch. Mr. Moe had found a new bride, Miss Hickory, but it does not seem as though that union is going to happen. The Moes have 3 children, Eenie, Meenie, and Miney. And there was an ice cream man a moment ago, but he has been run off by Mrs. Moe, and we'll pick up from where that leaves off. Out of sight, sighed Mr. Moe, as the barrow disappeared among the trees. But not, alas, out of mind. We mustn't grumble, boys, he brightened. We still have the wedding feast. Now, Mrs. Hickory, where will you sit? Mrs. Hickory's dimples twinkled gaily. She won't sit anywhere, Samuel. She has not received an invitation. The dimples disappeared again. Oh, but Matilda, cried Mr. Moe with a crestfallen look on his rosy face. But me no buts, Mrs. Moe retorted, advancing toward the table. What's this? She demanded. Something's missing. A peach and an orange have disappeared. Who has been eating my apple pie? I have, said Michael nervously, but only a very small slice. And I took a peach, said Jane in a whisper. She found it hard to make the confession. Mrs. Moe looked so large and fierce. Oh, indeed, the knobbly woman turned to the children. And who invited you? Well, you see, began Jane, I was making a park, and suddenly I found myself, it happened, however could she explain? Don't hum and haw, Jane, if you please. Speak when you're spoken to, come when you're called, and Michael, do not gape like that. The wind may change, and where will you be? A voice that was as welcome as nuts in May sounded in their ears. Mary Poppins! Cried Michael in glad surprise, staring, for in spite of the changing wind, from her to Mr. Moe, for there, beneath the buttercup, was the crowded perambulator, and beside it stood a tidy shape, with buttoned shoes, tulip-trimmed hat, and parrot-headed umbrella. Oh, Mary, at last! Better late than never. How are you? Cried Mr. Moe. He darted round the end of the table and kissed her black-gloved hand. I knew he reminded me of someone, said Michael in a careful whisper. Look, Jane, their noses are just the same. Nicely, thank you, Cousin Sam. My goodness, how the boys have grown. With a ladylike air, she offered her cheek to Eenie, Meenie, and Miney. Mr. Moe looked on with a fond smile, but it faded as he turned to his wife. And this, he said sadly, is Matilda. Mary Poppins regarded Mrs. Moe with a long and searching look. Then she smiled, the children's great surprise, and made a dainty bow. I hope, she said in a well-bred voice, that we are not intruding. I wanted Sam, with your permission, of course, Matilda, she bowed again to Mrs. Moe, to make me a new... It's ready, Mary, cried Mr. Moe, and he seized his piece of polished wood. All it wants is, he flew to the perambulator, a nail here and a nail there, and another one, and it's finished. A brand-new handle gleamed in its place, and John and Barbara clapped their hands. Don't think you're going to get it free, said Mrs. Moe, shook the rolling pin. From now on, everything's got to be paid for. Nothing for nothing. That's my motto. Oh, I'll certainly pay him, said Mary Poppins with her best society simper. Everyone gets what he deserves. That's my motto, Matilda. Well, the quicker the better, please, Miss Poppins. I've no intention of waiting. You won't have to wait, I promise you. Mary Poppins gave a twirl to her handbag, and Jane and Michael watched with interest as she glanced round the little park. They had never seen her behave like this, such elegant tact, such polished manners. What a charming little place you have. She waved the parrot-headed umbrella toward the summer house. Mrs. Moe gave a snort of disgust. Charming, you call it? I call it a hovel. If Samuel thinks I can live in that, he'll have to change his mind. He's not going to knock me down with a feather. Oh, I wouldn't dream of it, Matilda. I don't possess such a thing. A castle is what I want, Samuel. You owe it to your handsome bride. Handsome is as handsome does, said Mr. Moe in a whisper, but Mary Poppins' smile grew brighter. Handsome indeed, she agreed admiringly. And you're wearing such a lovely wreath. Pooh, Mrs. Moe remarked with contempt. 2 or 3 flowers twisted together, a crown of gold would be more to my liking, and I'll have it, too, before I'm finished. Kind hearts are more than coronets, said Mr. Mo weakly. Not to me, snapped Mrs. Mo. I'll have a beaded band of gold. You mark my words, Miss Mary Poppins. I'll be queen of the forest yet. I do not doubt it, said Mary Poppins, and her manner was so correct and respectful that Mrs. Mo smiled a mollified smile, displaying her 2 front teeth. Well, she said grudgingly, now that you're here, you'd better stay and be useful. You may pass round the food at the wedding feast, and then you can wash up the dishes. The children clapped their hands to their lips and glanced at Mary Poppins. What would she say to that, they wondered. Mr. Mo gave a gasp of horror. But Matilda, don't you realize? Don't you know who she is? That will do, Sam, said Mary Poppins. She waved him aside with the parrot umbrella. Her blue eyes had grown a shade more blue, but, to Jane and Michael's astonishment, her smile was broader than ever. So pleased to be of use, Matilda, and where do you plan to build your castle? Well, I thought, Mrs. Mo fell back a step and swung the rolling pin, we'd have the entrance gates here and here. She took another large stride backwards. The main door and the marble steps. But we can't dwell in marble halls, Matilda. They're far too grand for us. For you, perhaps, Samuel. Nothing can be too grand for me. And then, Mrs. Mo fell back again, a large and lofty reception room where I shall receive my guests. Splendid, said Mary Poppins brightly, pushing the perambulator before her as she followed step by step. And behind her marched Mr. Mo and the children, followed by Eenie, Meenie, and Miney, and Mrs. Hickory and her babies, all of them gazing as if in a trance at the 2 figures before them. The ballroom here, shouted Mrs. Mo, sweeping the rolling pin about her. Ballroom? Mr. Mo groaned. But who is going to use it? I am, said Mrs. Mo, smirking. And you'll please let me do the talking, Samuel. Silence is golden, Matilda, remember, Mr. Mo warned her. Oh, pray go on, urged Mary Poppins, advancing another foot. Drawing room, dining room, pantry, kitchen. Chamber by chamber the castle grew, invisible but imposing. With every word, Mrs. Mo fell backwards. With every word, Mary Poppins stepped forward, and the rest of the party followed. They were almost across the park now, for Mrs. Mo's rooms were large and airy, and nearing the edge of the woodland. My bedroom will be here, she declared, swinging her arms in a wide circle. And next to it, the rolling pin wheeled again through the air, I shall have a spacious nursery. That will be nice for the boys, Matilda. Mr. Mo brightened at the thought. Mrs. Mo gave him a scornful glance. Eenie, Meenie, and Miney, she said, can fend for themselves in the attic. The nursery will be for my own children, and if she brings me a reference saying she is honest and reliable, Mrs. Mary Poppins may come look after them. But she's looking after us, cried Michael. He seized a fold of the sprigged skirt and pulled her to his side. It's kind of you, Matilda, I'm sure, but I never give references. Mary Poppins' eyes had a curious glint as she thrust the perambulator forward. Then you're of no use to me, declared Mrs. Mo, strutting backwards through her invisible mansion. Oh, indeed, Mary Poppins' balmy tones had now an icy edge. Yes, indeed, retorted Mrs. Mo. I won't have people in my castle who are likely to steal the silver. And don't look at me like that, she added. There was now a note of alarm in her voice, as though there was something frightening in the smiling face that pursued her. Like what? Said Mary Poppins softly, and she gave the perambulator another push. Mrs. Mo retreated again and raised her rolling pin. Away with you! Be off! She cried. You're an uninvited guest. Her face was the color of her apron, and her large body trembled. Oh, no, I'm not, said Mary Poppins, moving forward like an oncoming storm. You told me to stay and wash the dishes. Well, I take it back, quavered Mrs. Mo. You pay us what you owe and be gone. I won't have you in my park. The rolling pin shivered in her hand, and she stumbled backward into the forest shade. Your park, did you say? Murmured Mary Poppins, advancing with even quicker steps. Yes, mine. Oh, Samuel, do something, can't you? I won't have her smiling at me like that. Oh, let me go. Oh, what has caught me? I'm stuck. I can't get free. What is it? As she spoke, an arm went round her waist and strong hands gripped her by the wrist. Behind her stood a stalwart figure, smiling triumphantly. A headdress of feathers was on his brow. A bow and some arrows hung from one shoulder, and the other was draped with a striped blanket. At last, I find my... And again we have a terrible racial slur that I will not be reading, but people used to think that it meant wife of an Indian person. That is not what it means. It is not a good word to use in any context. He grasped his wriggling captor closer. "Let me go, you savage!" shrieked Mrs. Moe as she turned and beheld the face. "Let go? Not I. What I find I keep. You shall come with me to my wigwam." "I won't. Unhand me Samuel. Tell him to set me free." Oh, I wouldn't dare. He's far too strong, and the best of friends must part, Matilda. Free? Nay. Free? Nay, nay, you shall be my slave. There, said the Indian cheerfully as he strung some yellow beads round her head and stuck a feather in the knob of her hair. This I give as a great honor. Now you're Indian too. I'm not. I won't. Oh, help. Oh, Sam. Well, you wanted a crown of beaded gold, and you seem to have got it, my dear. Wash in the stream, cook over twigs. The Indian wrinkled his nose at her. All the wide greenwood for your house, and the sky above for your roof. That's larger than the largest castle. Mr. Moe gave her a beaming glance. Nay, struggle not, said the Indian as Mrs. Moe tried to wriggle away. A good, and we'll just say wife instead of the word that P.L. Travers wrote, a good wife obeys her master, and a queen must do the same. Queen! Cried Mrs. Moe, wildly kicking. The Indian tossed his head proudly. Did you not know I was king of the forest? Matilda! How splendid! Just what you wanted. I didn't. Not in this way. There are more ways than one of being a queen, said Mary Poppins primly. Mrs. Moe turned on her in a fury. She drummed with her feet on the Indian's shins and brandished the rolling pin. This is your doing, you wolf in sheep's clothing. Things were going so nicely until you came. Oh, Samuel, why did you let her in? Mrs. Moe burst into angry tears. Nicely for you, said Mary Poppins, but not for anyone else. A wolf? A lamb, you mean, Matilda? I didn't let her in. She came. As if I could keep that wolf from the door. Mr. Moe laughed at his little joke. Oh, help me, Samuel. Set me free, and I'll lend you the 3-penny piece. And the boys can have a slice of pie every second Friday. Mrs. Moe, with an imploring gesture, flung out her knobbly arms. What? She cried, glaring at each in turn. Does nobody want me back? There was silence in the little group. Mr. Moe glanced at his 3 sons and then at Mary Poppins, one by one. All shook their heads. Coo-roo, coo-roo, they don't want you, cooed the doves as they fluttered past. Oh, what shall I do? Wailed Mrs. Moe. I want you, Matilda, the Indian cried. I need you, Matilda, to boil the pot, sweep the wigwam, sew the moccasins, make the arrows, fill the pipe, and on every second Monday, Matilda, you shall sit on the blanket beneath a moonbeam and feed on wild strawberries, snakes, and nut cream. Snakes! Moonbeams! Let me go! I eat nothing but mutton chops! Oh, help! Murder! Ambulance! Fire! Her voice rose to an anguished scream as the Indian flung her over his shoulder and stepped back into the woodland. Clasping his struggling burden tightly, he glanced at the 3 little boys.